Welcome to those tuning into this video, and thanks so much for joining us at the 92nd Street Y. My name is Maya Sweedler. I'm a reporter at the Associated Press who covers democracy, elections, and the electoral process. It's my great honor to introduce Professor Cass Sunstein, the Robert Walmsley University professor at Harvard Law School. His work spans topics ranging from constitutional law to administrative law to behavioral economics. In addition to his scholarship, Professor Sunstein has a long record of public service, including serving as a clerk to Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall and as the administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. His previous works include The Partial Constitution, Nudge, The Cost-Benefit State, and many, many more. Today, we will be talking about his latest work, On Liberalism in Defense of Freedom, which was released on September 2nd. This book contains 6 essays that address topics ranging from what liberalism is, to the value of experiments of living, to the rule of law, and how liberals think about free markets. So let's start with the basics. Professor Sunstein, what is liberalism?
Liberalism is a set of ideas that include a holy trinity: freedom, pluralism, and the rule of law. There are other ideas involving self-government and dignity and separation of powers, but the idea is that people get to live their lives. They get to be kind of authors of the narrative of their lives. They get to be diverse. So if you want to make shoes or have a podcast, or if you want to have a little construction company, as my dad did, you can do that within limits, of course. And freedom entails freedom of speech, freedom of religion. It's important to see that liberalism has its heroes, including John Stuart Mill and Friedrich Hayek. James Madison and Alexander Hamilton are also heroes of liberalism. You can be right of center and a liberal. Ronald Reagan was a liberal in this sense. So was George W. Bush. So was his dad. You can be left of center and be a liberal. So is Barack Obama. So was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. There are many heroes of Anglo-American politics and thinking who are right of center liberals, and there are many who are left of center liberals.
One of the key things that emerged to me throughout this book was this concept of big tent liberalism, which you've kind of touched on in running through a broad political swath of figures there. And a lot of this book is devoted to highlighting areas in which liberals can disagree. Can you kind of talk through the types of what you call these fundamental matters where there's room for disagreement and why that's so important to liberalism?
Yes, I thank you for drawing attention to big tent liberalism, which was almost the title of the book. My publisher, I think, thought people would have thought this is a book about tents, and who wants to buy a book about tents? Not that many people. So it's called On Liberalism. But a theme of the book is big tent liberalism. So you could have a liberal who thinks with Ronald Reagan that government's kind of a problem and we need to make it smaller. You could think with Elon Musk that we should eliminate maybe a lot of government functions and go back to an earlier time. You can think that and be a liberal. Or you can think with Roosevelt or with, let's say, modern left of center liberals, that it's essential to have a Department of Education, essential to have a social safety net. You can endorse what Roosevelt called the Second Bill of Rights, which includes a right to a good education, a right to a job, a right to protection against the vicissitudes of life, which might mean you get sick or you get disabled or you get incapacitated, the government should protect you. You could believe in a second Bill of Rights a la Roosevelt and be a liberal. These are extremely animated debates. So as a kid lawyer, I worked both for President Carter and for President Reagan, and I saw the transition from Carter to Reagan, and it was a kind of whoosh where some of Carter's beliefs, which line up, broadly speaking, with the Democratic Party, were in grave tension with those of President Reagan, which at the time, and I think now, line up with the right of the Republican Party. But both Reagan and Carter, and I worked as a lawyer for them, were committed to the rule of law, so they were liberals in that sense. They were both strongly committed to freedom of speech, so they were liberals in that sense. They were really big on freedom of religion, so they were liberals in that sense. But of course, they intensely disagreed. The Affordable Care Act which I like broadly, I like it a lot. That's a liberal achievement consistent with some of Roosevelt's thinking about a right to health care. But you can be a liberal and think the government shouldn't be doing that. That should all be private. You might think that private insurance companies and the market do a lot better than the government ever could. And the Affordable Care Act is a big mistake. So as these examples suggest, there are very intense disagreements within the broad liberal family under the broad liberal tent. And I would have thought, I think 15 years ago, that it was best to focus on the disagreements and not
Mhm.
best to focus on the commonalities. But in an era in which President Putin is in some ways riding high, in which uh, Viktor Orban in Hungary is a widely influential leader who doesn't like liberalism at all. And he calls for illiberal democracy. That the big tent that aligns people who disagree on much, is a glorious human achievement. And it was good to knock down that wall, Mr. Gorbachev. It's good to keep that tent uh, visible and big and prosperous.
What do you kind of see of the freedoms that you identified as key tenets of liberalism? Which ones are kind of the most important for creating this Big Ten and which allow for the most room for conversations within it?
Well, I love your formulation of the question because you went right to conversation, and you can't have that without freedom of speech.
Mhm.
So when liberalism was being named in 1815, 1820, the ideas, of course, preceded that, but liberalism kind of got off on a kind of very energetic footing then. Freedom of speech was front and center. So that's sometimes described in US law as the precondition for rights, the rights that makes all other rights possible. And I think we have to uh, uh, celebrate and put in the sky in big, bold letters, freedom of speech. A Supreme Court justice said during World War II, in a very important opinion, compulsory unification of opinion achieves only the unanimity of the graveyard. And that's a really good cautionary note. Uh, Freedom of speech ensures against the unanimity of the graveyard, because you're going to have people who say abortion is a form of murder, and you're going to have people who say that abortion is a protected right, it's part of the right to choose, or people think affirmative action is a terrible thing, a form of racial discrimination, and people who think that affirmative action is a very important thing, a way of responding to past injustice and unequal opportunity. And if you have freedom of speech, all that and much more can be said. You can say that the best way forward is signaled by some of what Mr. Musk promoted, and others who say, and I tend to agree with them, by the way, that that isn't the best way forward. Not at all. So freedom of speech, number one. Number two, I think freedom of religion. And, to rank it below anything is kind of horrible, because there's central importance to freedom of religion. So if people want to practice their faith, whether they are Catholics or Protestants or Jews or Muslims or agnostics, that's not a faith, but it's a way of centering your own convictions about things. They have freedom. Now we can say to them, that's wrong, and we can even say that's gravely wrong. Um, but freedom of religion is central to liberalism, and is central for more than one reason. First, it respects individual conscience, and it's possible to think from the standpoint of religious commitments that that is part of what God wants. It's also possible to think that we need to find a way to live together, everybody. And if you have, a conviction that is, let's say, Catholic, and your convictions butt up against the convictions of those who are Jewish, there's going to be not toleration, but not just toleration. Toleration's too soft. It's a little grudging. There's going to be respect. And that helps us all live together. It can also emphasize that in a nation in which people regard each other as potential partners in one or a dozen things, maybe they'll even get married. I was not raised Catholic, but I was married in the Catholic Church to a Catholic woman. Oh, maybe they'll get married, but maybe they'll be friends, and maybe they'll be trading partners. So come to my store. I'm going to sell you all sorts of things. And I don't care what God you believe in, or even if you believe in God, just come by. And that makes social interaction feasible. It leads to smiles rather than grimaces, and it makes economic growth possible. So some of the arguments for free trade at the time when those arguments were both contentious and very vigorous, or if people see each other as trading partners, then they don't, look at each other with suspicion and horror. They look at each other as at least a kind of partner.
I'm struck by the fact that the first two freedoms that you identified are two of the ones in the First Amendment. Is there anything particularly unique or distinctive about the way liberalism intersects with the American Constitution and kind of what our country is based on that you could share?
Yeah, I think so. So the fact that freedom of speech and freedom of religion are both in the First Amendment isn't a coincidence. We shifted, that is, we meaning Americans, starting with the colonists, from a commitment to monarchy to a commitment to republicanism, small r, where republicanism entails self-government and basically respect for the equal dignity of everyone. And I say this with some emotion because my house is in Concord, Massachusetts, where the revolution itself started. And you can feel a little bit in the air in Concord the legacy of the equality of persons. And if you're committed to Republican self-government, the equality of persons, then you will put freedom of speech and freedom of religion front and center. What you will fear is a stifling of the human spirit. uh, Now, freedom of religion allows conscience, at least in a certain domain, to flourish and people to find their own way. And freedom of speech is a way of respecting individual dignity, but also discovering, if conditions are pretty good, what's true. So, someone might say vaccines cause cancer or are made for and by space aliens, and others might say actually vaccines are really good, and my view, and then we can talk it through, and under at least good conditions, what's true will ultimately prevail.
Can you connect these to this John Stuart Mill idea that you talk about of experiments of living? We've kind of touched on the importance of conversation, but what's the value of these experiments that come up in the book a couple times?
Okay, so the experiments of living idea is kind of the beating heart of the book, and it's an unusual choice. So thank you for spotlighting it. That is, when we think of a liberal polity, experiments of living, that's not where we go first. But it's John Stuart Mill's phrase, and I think it's clarifying. Um, let's think about some different experiments of living. I was in China a few decades ago and my right shoe broke. And here's American in China, the shoe is broken, kind of hard to walk. What's to be done? And I was taken by my Chinese host to a guy who was on the street who was fixing shoes. And I got to talk to him. He had some pretty good English. And he said, I'm fixing shoes. That's my job. The government doesn't license me in particular, and it doesn't take any of the money I earn. It said it's given general permission to us to do this. And he said it with not quite rapture, but something kind of in the direction of rapture, saying, this is, I get to do this. And it was an experiment he was doing, and he was doing really well. He was, by his lights, making a lot of money, and he loved it. He loved helping people. He loved fixing shoe. He was amazing at fixing shoes. And that's a kind of example of an experiment of living that doesn't involve, religion. It doesn't involve necessarily some deep, innovative venture in how to live, but it was an experiment. I also have a family member who has a ordinary job from which he makes a living, but he really is creative and he wants to do something creative. He's making films. They're little films. You can find them on YouTube. He's trying to start out as a filmmaker and having at least some success. What's much more important than the success, I think, is that he gets to express himself in this way. And my shoe fixing guy was kind of similar. He wasn't, making movies, but he was expressing something he really cares about. In a liberal society, you get to fix shoes. The government doesn't tell you, no, you can't, maybe because you have the wrong religion or you haven't pleased the right official. And in a liberal society, you also get to make films if that's what you want to do. Even if you're not making any money at all or hardly any money, you get to do that experiment. Now, these are things about like occupation. I think that's very important to Mill, but it's not the most important. And here's my view about Mill and experiments of living. He fell in love with a married woman, Harriet Taylor. She fell in love with him. What happened between them while she was married, who knows? But the feelings were as strong, I think, as human feelings get. And the letters between them are almost unbearably beautiful, both their attachment to each other and their delicacy with words and with each other, and her kind of firmness when her husband was dying to him, when he kind of needed her in his heart, but she wasn't going to be available. And she said some version of back off. I love my husband. He's dying. And that scandal, which Mill was part of, I think was a motivation for his experiments of living idea. It was about, it happened between us and, led us really. And the idea that in your individual life, whether it involves friendships or romance or something else, led us. Now, of course, there are boundaries. There are things that aren't permissible and shouldn't be. But with a wide range, the liberal view is, if you are a male and you fall in love with a male, I think the flowering of the liberal tradition is the law won't stand in your way. Um, if you want to live with a group of people and try to do something that involves, let's say, fruits and vegetables, or that involves some new thing, let's call it AI, you get to do that too. And that is an engine for economic productivity, and that's super important and shouldn't be undervalued. But it's also an engine for the human soul. And that is something that liberals cherish.
I really did love the essay on Mill and his wife and kind of tracing their relationship. The excerpts of their letters were lovely. So for those who buy the book, I highly recommend taking your time with that chapter. Can you talk a little bit about the balance between where the rule of law comes in and where social mores come in with experiments of living? And how do you balance the fact that social mores and the rule of law might not always be on the same page?
Okay, so the rule of law means something pretty simple, which is the citizen can't be punished for doing something that was lawful at the time they did it. No retroactive application of the law. It means the law has to be understandable, so people have notice about what they're supposed to do. It means the law can't change so rapidly that people can't keep up. It means the law has to mean in reality on the ground what it means on the books. So if the law on the book says one thing, but on the ground people are being rounded up and put in jail, that's a violation of the rule of law. So the rule of law has its own morality. It's not everything that liberals would want. You can have a system where the law says you can't ever use any word beginning with the word F. That's consistent with the rule of law. It's clear. It's not being applied retroactively. It's a violation of freedom of speech, but there's the rule of law. Okay, then there are social norms, which might say that you should be considerate to people, you shouldn't lie, you shouldn't manipulate people. But the law doesn't make inconsiderateness or lying or manipulation a crime. One reason is it's really hard to define. I wrote a book on manipulation. I really struggled with it. It's really hard to define manipulation. Considerateness, there's some fantastic philosophical work, but to specify what that means is very difficult. So you can't do that really consistently with the rule of law. And even if you could make progress in defining considerateness, if someone on the subway is inconsiderate or one of your friends in the workplace is rude and not considerate, they maybe don't pick up in a common room, they leave their coffee cups or something, that to make that a crime would be pretty rough. So there are social norms that guarantee a bunch of things that aren't proscribed by law. I think we should also say, and this goes to some very vigorous debates right now, that there are things in social norms that you might love or not love. I generally love them, but not everyone does. Norms that involve the family and community and respect for one another that liberal societies probably depend on, that it would be illiberal to mandate. So there are norms in every community and in every family that maybe aren't a product of individual choice. So if you respect your parents, probably the respect precedes deciding to respect your parents. And maybe on reflection, we do decide to respect our parents if they're worthy of respect. But there's an emotional component to how we feel towards our parents and our communities and our families and maybe our nation, that it wouldn't be quite right to say we choose those things. Though maybe on reflection, we decide that feeling those things is worthy and we should, but still the emotional commitment is not itself kind of a liberal exercise of choice. And there might be norms. I think societies, I'm recently returned from Ireland and I live in the United States. And in Ireland, the United States, there are norms that are not embodied in law. Hooray for their not embodiment of the law, and also hooray for their existence because our life together depends on them.
So, kind of shifting gears to talking more about contemporary society, what do you see as the most significant threats to liberalism right now?
In nations which have amazing people and incredible histories and incredible achievements, and I'm thinking of Russia and China and Hungary, there are forces of illiberalism that are prospering. And we have to say that in China, the achievements of the last decades and the amazingness is off the charts. At the same time, that respect for freedom of speech, respect for the rule of law, that's not off the charts. In Russia, an incredible history and the uh, achievements in helping to win World War II. We should forever, I think, be grateful to Russia and the bravery, but the uh, disrespect for individual dignity, the killing occasionally of people because of what they think, that's illiberalism on steroids, and it's extremely worrisome. In Europe and the United States, there are forces of illiberalism where the Hungarian uh, model is being held up, which includes strong nationalism. I think that is consistent with liberal ideas, but attacks on private institutions that are exercising freedom of speech, that's not consistent with liberal ideals. In Europe and North America, there are illiberal forces. And while mine is not a political book, I've worked in both Republican and Democratic administrations. The fact is that some of what we're observing in the United States, I mean, deregulation, that can be great, and it's certainly consistent with liberal ideas, but a failure, let's say, rigorously to follow, I'm phrasing this delicately, legal requirements is not consistent with the rule of law. Attacking individuals or law firms because of their endangering them in part because of their political convictions. That's, if a Democrat did that, that would be in tension with the rule of law. If a Democrat went after, let's say, Brigham Young University, which is right of center, or Texas A&M University, both great universities that are right of center, and tried to bring them to heel, that would be in tension with liberal ideas. So I wouldn't want to say that in the United States or Europe we have, the number one obstacle to liberal ideals. China, Russia, and Hungary are better examples, but there are forces of illiberalism here. There are forces of illiberalism on the left, where liberalism is, among some on the left, kind of a terrible word. And freedom of speech is sometimes said on the left to be an ally of the powerful and the wealthy. That's sometimes true. It's hardly always true, but there have been occasionally on the left concerns about freedom of speech, and that's not a good thing at all. I wouldn't list that first because the kind of progressive left isn't, let's say, riding high in terms of political power. But when and if it does, it's profoundly to be hoped that it will respect liberal commitments, and not grudgingly, but with celebration and a respectful nod.
Are there specific aspects of this work that you hope will speak to the different types of liberal groups that you've sort of just laid out around the world?
Thank you for that. I really do. So, um, uh, if I were to evaluate my own book, the first word that would come to mind is not profoundly original. If I were reviewing my book, I wouldn't say profoundly original. I hope there are some parts that aren't, that are maybe not so well known, but the idea is what we need now across the world is a kind of rising up among people on the right and the left of the liberal spirit. So the idea that the rule of law, pluralism, and freedom are three things which every society deserves. That seems to me fundamental for humanity's future. And I was in China, as noted, when I met my shoe fixing guy. I also saw a bunch of incredible people who were very, uh, committed to their nation, but who also saw, one of them wrote a paper about the rule of law, saw the rule of law, pluralism, and freedom as not Western ideals, but ideals with very deep roots in the Chinese tradition. So I'd like to see a redawning of liberal principles with an understanding that liberalism is always to be made and not found, that there's a ton to be done with respect to current things. Think about your favorite issues, whether it involves manipulation through AI, whether it involves environmental challenges, whether it involves road safety, whether it involves the best approach to immigration, bringing to bear and renewing and improving liberal ideas in those contexts. That's a fantastic set of projects.
Does the defense of liberalism differ in non-Western contexts? And what lessons can global liberal movements learn from each other to adapt effectively to varying cultural and institutional landscapes?
What a fantastic question. So I was in a non-democratic nation a few years ago. This is recently, and it was a nation that is doing great things. I'm not going to name it because of confidentiality, but they were pretty formal with me, and most of the discussions were within the bounds of kind of government person meeting someone who I'm occasionally in government, so they treated me that way. We had a lunch where it got less formal. And they said, democracy can't work. Elections, all that can't work. And they said it with a smile and with respect rather than as a punch. And I said, what do you mean? And they said, you can't plan. It's too unstable. It's, you have Trump, you have Obama, you have Biden. It's all very uh, chaotic. And the countries can't work like that. You need to be able to plan over time. And I said to them, well, I hear you. But one thing that's very important with elections is that if things are going wrong, there can be course correction because the public is saying, this is bad, do something different. And I expected that to be a pretty strong argument to them, but they looked at me and said, of course. And they said, we consult the people all the time. If we're going in a direction that's bad, we have constant communication with all sectors of our population to see what's sour and what can be made sweeter. So that's what we do. That's our central thing. And so as we had an exchange, to your point, liberal democratic ideals were being implemented in a sense in a non-liberal, non-democratic nation. And the communication we had, that I and my colleagues there had, was close to perfect. We completely understood each other. They were saying we need surrogates for elections since we don't have them, by which we learn from our citizens. And with respect for at least certain forms of freedom and pluralism and the rule of law, they were, I can't say on board, but they weren't indifferent to those things.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, they were responding to public opinion, but not in the way that, you know, a democracy that has some form of elections responds.
Completely. They didn't have a risk of losing power. So
Mhm.
they liked that for many reasons, the most honorable of which I think was they thought we can plan for the future. The understanding that because they didn't have to face reelection, they could be out of touch and really screw up, not their word. They got that. They didn't want to screw up. It's a government that, you know, wants to serve its people on principle. And you can't serve your people unless you know what they think and what their problems are. And they were on that train. So the idea of being a non-democratic nation that is highly attentive to what kinds of lives its citizens are living, that was an entree to a very agreeable conversation. Of course, we didn't agree in the end, but we could talk agreeably. And they were partaking of liberal ideas in emphasizing the necessity, the urgency of responsiveness to the people. Now, with freedom, this is not a nation, you know, there are many others that is that excited about US conceptions of freedom of speech. But there are ideas about freedom of speech that they do endorse. So to say the government is wrong on this and that, and there should be a different direction, to say that this country should learn from the United States and the United Kingdom, that's completely welcome and permitted. To allow lots of different religions is completely welcome and permitted. To respect in general the rule of law is at least a moral commitment that this non-Western, non-democratic nation had. And one reason the rule of law is really important is if your citizens don't know what the law is, it's going to be terrible. They're going to be violating it a lot because they don't know what it is. And they might find themselves in jail and extremely angry. And so are the other, you know, people in their community saying, why did they put them in jail? So they might be terrified and not rebel, but it's better to have people who are respectful of government's efforts than people who are terrified and terrified into quiescence. So I think it wouldn't be right to say that something like the Western democratic model is necessarily the right one for all times and places. That would be a little hubristic. But to say that respect for pluralism, freedom, and the rule of law are foundational, that that's a potentially successful project. We're
A
all
couple
very
things.
we're all very young. So when I say potentially successful, early days.
Gotcha. A couple points in that answer kind of reminded me of an interesting concept that came up in the chapter that dealt with freedom of speech, this idea of pluralistic ignorance, that sometimes you need to understand what people are thinking and understanding, and even if it's correct, and balance that with the need to correct misinformation with the idea that folks have the right to believe what they believe. How in the United States do you think we can learn from what other countries are doing with regard to pluralistic ignorance?
So pluralistic ignorance means that people don't know what other people think. And that can create problems and opportunities. So think, if you would, about, we'll get to other countries, think if you would about Me Too,
Mm,
where there was lots of horrific abuse, and many women who were subject to it didn't speak out, some of them not knowing how pervasive it was. And one woman who was very prominent in the Me Too movement said, I would have taken what this prominent person did to me to my grave, if not for the courage of other women who spoke out. And once they did, I felt free to say what I thought. If you think of movements of multiple kinds, both on the left and the right, let's say the pro-life movement, and let's say the civil rights movement, both of them prospered in part because people learned there were a lot of other people who thought what they did. Part of Martin Luther King Jr.'s genius was to give a green light or a permission slip, mostly to people of color, but also to white people, to say, what's up with the system of segregation? What's that about? Of course, the right words are more precise than that. Uh, in Saudi Arabia, there have been studies showing that young men think that it's completely fine if their wives work outside the home. They like and welcome that. But they think, most young men, that most young men don't think that. They think I'm kind of unusual in thinking that some form of movement towards sex equality is very good for everyone, including the finances. Once young men in Saudi Arabia are informed that most young men in Saudi Arabia think that it's fine for women like men to work outside of the home, then the number of women who are applying for and getting work outside of the home jumps. So Saudi Arabia has taught us that there's actually a stronger commitment to sex equality on the part of young men than young men themselves know, and that exposing that can fuel actual change in terms of what people are doing. Can I give you an example here? It's going to be a controversial example, but my view is that there are many more people who believe in protecting against cruelty and suffering of animals than people know. And that a lot of the distress and horror felt by non-human animals is a product of the fact that those who don't like that distress and horror silence themselves because they think other people would think you're a crazy person. I confess this is partly an autobiographical statement where I shut up for a number of years about my views about mistreatment of non-human animals. And I shut up because my experience in Washington was somewhere between unpleasant and scary. I got death threats because I had written some things that were pro-animal welfare. I think that's one where we can learn from Saudi Arabia and see that, many people are very horrified by what's happening, but they don't say so.
Where does the responsibility for bringing that awareness fall? Is that on some sort of governmental body? Is it on the media? Is it on, a citizens-driven movement? How does that work?
I think it's on each of us as individuals. So that's the first thing. So, and this is hard, isn't it? That if someone you know does or says something that you think is not good, it might be someone you like or love. And even if you don't like or love them, to speak out creates friction. But I think a little ramping up of courteous friction is probably a good idea for each of us. Then the media, of course, and such progress as we've seen on many issues, and this is on matters of fact, not necessarily matters of value. The media is the hero. I'm reading an amazing amount of material just these days, spurred by the release of a new book, not mine, on the Martian craze of the turn of the century, where there was a astronomer named Percival Lowell who claimed credibly that he had discovered canals on Mars and clear evidence of intelligent life on Mars. They're out there, they're Martians, we should try to communicate with them. And this was so widely believed that the Wall Street Journal declared the discovery of life on Mars to be the most important breakthrough of 1907. So this was in some ways pluralistic ignorance, that a lot of people thought this is crazy talk, but didn't say so because everyone else seemed to think that canals were on Mars and there was intelligent life on Mars. The media was the hero in drawing attention to what many people, including many scientists, thought was clearly true, which was that this is a fairy tale, this isn't real. I think media responsibility, and if I may say, anyone who works for government, having done so myself, I have a bow and salute to. But some of the things we're observing right now with respect to vaccine skepticism is highly reminiscent of some of what we observed with respect to there's life on Mars. It has the same kind of structure and uh, um, charisma on the part of some of the proponents, and uh, delving into detail in a way that's very impressive for outsiders. So media for sure. Government's a little trickier. So having had three stints, I guess I had three stints in the federal government and counting. Um, uh, the trustworthiness of the government as a debunker of things that people think other people believe is doubtable. And sometimes in government, correction of a falsehood doesn't do much good, and it might backfire. People might think, why are they denying it? That's proof that it's true. So there's some delicacy there. On the other hand, if you have trusted government uh, reporters, they may be in things that have names like bureaus and administrations, who are telling you data. There is evidence, empirical evidence, suggesting that people across the political spectrum believe it. So a measure of debunking has um, uh, immense importance from the government itself, even with the qualifications.
Is this something that can be accomplished with regulation? Like one example that I'm curious if it works in the context of what you're describing is cigarettes and the way the government kind of changed regulations around cigarettes about a half century ago. Does that kind of
Yeah,
fit with what you're saying?
completely. So
Mhm.
let's think of some examples where in a liberal society, I emphasized freedom, pluralism, and the rule of law, and not a commitment to truth. But I think it's fair to say there's a kind of epistemic foundation of liberal success, which is a belief that there is such a thing as truth and a commitment to processes for figuring out what it is. With cigarettes, my mother was a smoker. I remember a time vaguely when whether smoking was dangerous was a disputed question. Undoubtedly, it's true that many people who believe smoking was either dangerous or disgusting or both silenced themselves because there was a norm that people smoke. And to say that would be a little like saying people shouldn't eat meat now. It would seem a little antisocial and maybe slightly in some circles weird. But of course, the government's data showing that smoking is hazardous to your health was real data, it was true data, and it succeeded in at least spurring many people to stop smoking or to smoke less or to smoke at least with eyes wide open. And I'm thinking there are other examples of that that are maybe less famous. One that's kind of famous is you should buckle your seatbelts. And
Mhm.
that's, of course, undergirded by a factual claim that is consistent with, I think, liberal commitments to say not only through norms, but through law, seatbelt buckling and smoking less is something the government legitimately spurs. And then there's something called a toxic release inventory where the government gives data on toxic releases. And that's helped in reducing toxic releases because people don't want to be on the list. There's also, I think, still a greenhouse gas inventory, kind of modeled on the toxic release inventory. And that's a way of giving people information about greenhouse gas emissions. I should say in my second stint in the government, when I worked in the White House, I was the administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. And part of that office's responsibility is to oversee regulation and at least certain forms of information provision, including some related to smoking and the environment. And of course, if government is trustworthy or trustworthy to many, getting data out is essential.
It is 2025, so I do have to ask about AI. In the chapter on the rule of law, when discussing hearing rights, you wrote, as the likelihood of an inaccurate outcome diminishes, it becomes less necessary to insist on extensive procedural safeguards. If the government uses an algorithm that is pretty well guaranteed to be accurate, a reduced hearing might well be in order. I understood that to be kind of opening the door for algorithmically guided decisions, possibly even artificial intelligence. Can you expand on the role that something like AI could play in a liberal society?
Yeah, let's talk about this. This is pretty fundamental. So suppose someone is accused of doing something wrong. We have in liberal societies a right to due process, meaning they can't just lock you up and throw away the key. You have a right to a hearing. Let's kind of cry that from the rooftops. I read as a law student that Justice Frankfurter, Supreme Court Justice, said the history of liberty in Anglo-American societies is in large part a history of procedural safeguards. And I remember as if it were yesterday reading that and thinking, what an old, boring guy Frankfurter is. Think of procedural safeguards as the history of liberty. I mean, who was this guy? But of course, he was super wise. And maybe now, today, we see this more than we did 15 years ago, that the idea that the government can't punish you or hurt you without you're getting a right with a lawyer to go to an impartial judge, that's kind of bedrock, and it's liberal bedrock. It's part of freedom, the due process clause. So then we ask, what's the due process clause about? And thank you for tolerating this longish answer. Part of what the due process clause about is ensuring against mistakes. So if the government wants to lock you up for doing something bad, your lawyer can say you didn't do it, or there's no law you violated. And the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court has said prevention of mistakes is fundamental. Okay, let's go with that a little bit. If you have AI that can tell you for sure whether the person accused of, let's say, Social Security fraud did it, then that might be the process that's due. If it's completely reliable, if it knows with 100% or super close to 100% accuracy, maybe it's better than a human judge would be. So, and the Supreme Court, it kind of went there in the 1970s saying, if you have some process where you can figure it out without having an oral hearing with people participating, that might be all the process that's due. So if you have really accurate AI, it might be able to do the same thing that a hearing would do. Now, people don't jump for joy saying, hooray, that's progress when they hear that. And here's one reason why. I said the key reason for hearing rights is accuracy, but that might be overstated or inadequate. There's another reason for hearing rights, which is dignity. So that if you are accused of doing something wrong, you have a right to be heard, not just to ensure against mistakes, but also for the official apparatus to recognize that you matter, that you have dignity, that you have a right to be heard as a person by a person. And Kafka's kind of horror stories are partly about people being lost in a morass in which their humanity isn't recognized. So that's a cautionary note against uses of AI as all of the process that's due. Maybe people have a right to be heard in person or by a lawyer who knows them, who's human, a human to human, and that's about individual dignity. And that's a pretty liberal idea.
Gotcha. So I'd like to end by asking you to reflect on your decades of contributions from nudge to noise and beyond. What intellectual surprises or unexpected critiques have most challenged your thinking on liberalism over the years, and how have they reshaped your approach?
Thank you for that. So nudging is interventions that preserve freedom of choice while steering people in certain directions. So if you were given a warning, this has peanuts in it, don't eat it if you have an allergy, that's a nudge. If you're automatically enrolled in some savings plan, but you can opt out, that's a nudge also. The best objection I've seen to nudging is that people should be making active choices and learning rather than being nudged. So they should learn, for example, how to get from one place to another rather than rely on a GPS. They should make an active choice about their plans so they can learn it. Now, I think there's a version of that that is productive of exhaustion on the part of the individual person who's trying to live their lives and not learn everything about everything. But the emphasis on agency and learning as an objection to nudging, I think that's important, and I've learned a lot from that. On liberalism, which is something I've worked on and off for the past X number of years, where X isn't a small number, but very intensely just in the last 3 years. The thing that I've struggled with most about is an objection from the right, which is that liberalism tends to eat up its preconditions. And the objection is that liberalism depends on people having non-liberal emotional commitments. That is, unchosen commitments. We discussed this a bit, to family, to faith, to community, etc. And liberalism tends to uh, uh, destroy those things. I think this is a deeply false objection in the end. And I spent some time in my alleged book urging why it's deeply false, but it's a haunting objection. And it needs to be kept in mind, I think, by all those who cherish the liberal tradition.
Thank you so much. I know you've done a lot of these. I was trying to keep it a little less technical than
I love
some of
that.
the
So,
others.
yeah, it was the best one I've done so far. So I really thank you. Yeah,
All right. Well, I appreciate your time.
thanks.